Edward Kavanagh of Glack went out to the hill one day for to check after his sheep. As he reached the top of the hill, he met two odd young men that he had never seen before. The men took him by the arms and put him down, sitting behind a rush bush, and there he sat. He couldn't move or speak. Soon Kavanagh was missed, and all the local people went out looking for him. Up and down the hills and in nearby waters they went, and not a one could see him anywhere. For 2 days the people of the parish searched for Kavanagh. At the end of 2 days, one of them went to the priest. Well, the priest told them that Kavanagh was not drowned or lost, but that he was sitting behind a rush bush in Nelson's field, and if he was not got before the sunset on the following evening, that he would come home himself. On the following evening, as the sun was setting, all the people were watching for him on Nelson's field, and suddenly they saw him appear, walking down the field. All the people were glad to have him back and desperately wanted to know what had happened to him. He told them that as he was going up the side of the hill, 2 young men took him and left him behind a rush bush. He said he watched all the people running around looking for him for 2 days, but he could not rise from where he was sitting or even speak to them. Though he was clearly there all the while, the people were unable to see him at all. When he arose the next morning from his own bed, Kavanagh was blind in one eye. It was believed if he had kept the fairies' prank a secret, not told where he was or what happened to him, that he would not have been blinded. There was a big, queer animal seen around here not so long ago. It was a strange thing, as big as a donkey, but it had the shape of a dog, and it was always seen by the villagers of Ballinastack whenever there had been a death in the village. It was believed that this creature lived with, or at least near, a particular woman that lived in the village. This woman was well known in the village, as it was believed that she had been with the fairies, that is to say, to have lived with the fairies for 7 whole years. So familiar was the woman with this dog-like creature that she named it Charlie. Local folk noticed that if this woman told too much about her time with the fairies, she would be black and blue in the morning, with Charlie having beat her. Well, this animal she called Charlie could transform itself into anything it liked, and if this woman that was with the fairies went to visit the neighbour's house and stayed too long, she would say, "I must go home now, Charlie is pinching me." When she eventually passed away, this huge creature never visited the town again. I woke up with the pressure of a hand on my right shoulder, and I saw the old hag. She had long, craggy grey hair, a pale greenish face, a long nose, and creepiest of all, her eyes were all black. She smiled at me, then disappeared, and that's when I snapped out of the paralysis. Every time I have one of these experiences, I'm utterly exhausted, and something awful happens in my life soon after. I was sleeping one night when I woke suddenly. The room was exactly as it was when I fell asleep, but I couldn't move or scream. I saw an old, haggard-looking woman standing in front of my window. She quickly moved to me, knelt on my chest and stared into my face. I was terrified. Another time it happened, I was lying on my stomach and I saw her in my peripheral vision. She came over to the bed, crept her hand up the back of my head, down my face, and hooked her fingers under my top teeth and pulled my head back. I was visiting my gran at Twillingate for the summer. One night I was awakened by a heavy weight on my chest. There was someone kneeling on me and trying to strangle me. I tried to move my arms to push the person away, but I was unable to move them. I was never so terrified in my life. I started screaming, and after what felt like 10 minutes, Gran was suddenly beside my bed and the old hag was gone. She said she didn't hear my screams, but she heard something and came to my bedroom as she figured I was being hag-rode. Two nights ago, I woke to my girlfriend screaming. She had her arms up as if she was pushing on something. Her eyes were open, so I called her name a few times and tried to shake her awake. Then her eyes closed and she went back to sleep. In the morning, she told me that she was fighting an old lady that was trying to strangle her. Last night, I woke up again. I had no idea why, but I had a feeling that I should turn around and look at my girlfriend. As I turned around, I saw what looked like an old person's face moving away from me. At that exact moment, my girlfriend let out a small scream. Then she went back to sleep, and so did I. This morning, when we woke up, the first thing my girlfriend said was, "I had a dream about that old lady again last night." Now, what are the odds that both of us would see the same person or spirit, and why did it move away from me? My wife and I were sleeping in bed when I sensed or felt my wife was being attacked. I woke to find a shadow person on top of her, choking her. Well, I jumped out of bed and rushed towards it, and it moved away into the wall. I turned to see my wife still choking, and I woke her. She said she dreamed that she was being choked by a person on top of her. Once a man was coming home from a ceilidh, and on the road he met a dog with startling red eyes. The dog walked the whole way home with him, and when the man got home there was a terrible smell on him, and all his clothes had to be burned. The next day the man fell ill. Skin started peeling off his body, and after a few days he died. A woman was one night lying awake while her husband slept, when the door suddenly opened and a tall, dark man entered of fierce aspect, followed by an old hag with a child in her arms, a little misshapen, sickly-looking thing. They both sat down by the fire to warm themselves, and after some time the man looked over at the cradle that stood beside the mother's bed with her baby boy in it, and he kept his eyes on it for several minutes. Then He rose, and when the mother saw him walking over directly to the cradle, she fainted and knew no more. When she came to herself, she called out to her husband and bade him light a candle. This he did, on which the old hag in the corner rose up at once and blew it out. Then he lit it a second time, and again it was blown out, and still a third time he lit the candle, and again it was blown out, and a great peal of laughter was heard in the darkness. On this the man grew terribly angry, and taking up the tongs, he made a blow at the hag. But she slipped away and struck him on the arm with a stick she held in her hand. Then he grew more furious and beat her on the head until she roared. Then he pushed her outside and locked the door. After this, he lit the candle in peace. But when they looked at the cradle, lo, in place of their own beautiful boy, a hideous little creature, all covered with hair, lay grinning up at them. Great was their grief and lamentation, and both the man and his wife wept and wailed aloud for the loss of their child, and the cry of their sorrow was bitter to hear. Just then the door suddenly opened, and a young woman came in with a scarlet handkerchief wound round her head. "What are you crying for?" she asked, "at this time of night, when everyone should be asleep?" "Look at this child in the cradle," answered the man, "and you will cease to wonder why we mourn and are sad at heart." And he told her all the story. When the young woman went over to the cradle and looked at the child, she laughed but said nothing. "Your laughter is stranger than our tears," said the man. "Why do you laugh in the face of our sorrows?" "Because," she said, "this is my child that was stolen from me tonight, for I am one of the fairy race, and my people, who live under the fort on the hill, thought your boy was a fine child, and so they changed the babies in the cradle. But, after all, I would rather have my own, ugly as he is, than any mortal child in the world. So now I'll tell you how to get back your own son, and I'll take away mine at once. Go to the old fort on the hill when the moon is full, and take with you 3 sheaves of corn and some fire, and burn them one after the other. And when the last sheaf is burning, an old man will come up through the smoke, and he will ask you what it is you desire. Then tell him you must have your child back, or you will burn down the fort and leave no dwelling place for his people on the hill. Now the fairies cannot stand against the power of fire, and they will give you back your child at the mere threat of burning the fort. But mind, take good care of him after. Tie a nail from a horseshoe round his neck, and then he will be safe." With that, the young woman took up the ugly little imp from the cradle in her arms, and was away and gone before they could see how she got out of the house. Well, next night, when the moon was full, the man went to the old fort with the 3 sheaves of corn and the fire, and burned them one after the other. And as the second was lighted, there came up an old man and asked him what was his desire. "I must have my child again that was stolen," he answered, "or I'll burn down every tree on the hill, and not leave you a stone of the fort where you can shelter any more with your fairy kindred." Then the old man vanished, and there was a great silence, but no one appeared. On this the father grew angry, and he called out in a loud voice, "I am lifting the 3rd sheaf now, and I'll burn and destroy and make desolate your dwelling place, if my child is not returned." Then A great clamour was heard inside the fort, and a voice said, "Let it be! The power of the fire is too strong for us. Bring forth the child." And presently the old man appeared, carrying the child in his arms. "Take him," he said, "by the spell of the fire and the corn you have conquered. But take my advice. Draw a circle of fire with a hot coal this night round the cradle when you get home, and the fairy power cannot touch him any more by reason of the fire." So the man did as he was desired, and by the spell of fire and of corn the child was saved, and he grew and prospered. And the old fort stands to this very day, safe from harm, for the man would allow no hand to move a stone or harm a tree. And the fairies still dance there on the Rath when the moon is full, to the music of the fairy pipes, and no one hinders them. It was a summer night. My mum and sister were inside making dinner when this storm came out of nowhere. Now, as a little boy, I loved storms. I loved playing out in the rain and listening to the thunder. So, as soon as the waves of rain started pouring down, I ran outside and let the wetness enthrall me. After playing for some time in the rain, I sat under a tree and found some dandelions to play with. It was in that moment that I saw my dad walking towards me. Oh, I still remember how happy I was in that moment to see my dad walking towards me in the pouring rain. Neither of my parents ever played in the rain with me when it was downpouring. They'd watch me from a window or from the bench under the overhang, but they'd never risk getting drenched. He had on his usual attire, jeans, a red t-shirt and a black windbreaker. He looked like he had just jumped into the lake by the time he reached me. It was storming that badly. But he came up to me and he sat right by me under the tree and said, "What are you up to, Josh?" Well, I held up both hands and showed him the dandelions I'd collected. 2 yellow flowers held straight up between my thumbs and pointer fingers. "I got these plants. Now I'm looking for bugs to eat them." He looked at the dandelions inquisitively. "You know, I bet a lot of the bugs are hiding from the rain. I'll help you find some once it stops raining." A low rumble of thunder rolled through the sky from the distance. My eyes landed on his, waiting for him to tell me it was no longer safe to play outside. Instead, he surprised me with his answer. "You know, I don't see any lightning. We can play a bit longer." My dirty blonde hair was matted to my forehead by this point. It was raining so hard. But a huge smile spread from ear to ear as the words my dad said registered. He was being awesome. He sat with his legs crossed in the grass and leaned forward. His eyes darted around the yard, then they lit up as he spotted something. His thumb and pointer finger dug down between the blades of grass and out popped a worm. The brown thing wiggled and writhed as he held it up in the air. Black clumps of wet dirt fell off the slimy creature as it danced in the summer rain. Whoa! I dropped the dandelions to fall back to the earth. "Do you want to hold the worm, Josh?" I reached out and grabbed the thing with one hand. Each end of the worm swayed from the top and bottom of my hand. It tickled my palm as I held it tight, which made me laugh. "Hey, I tell you what, how about you and I go down to the lake? We can hold it in the water and see if a fish comes up to eat it." I scurried to my feet as fast as I could. Cool! The biggest grin still stretched across my face. My dad was letting me do things he normally wouldn't. For a split second, I wondered if my sister would want to come down to the lake with us. She would think it was interesting to see a fish eat a worm right out of my hand, after all. I looked up to the house to see if she was near the window so that I could wave her down. What I saw instead still terrifies me all these years later. I saw my dad in the window, staring back at me, panic written all over his face. The rain pitted and pattered against the window, and it distorted the imagery, but there was no denying that my dad was now in the house. I looked back through the yard and saw what looked to be my dad standing beside me, except now he had his hand out and was more persistent about going down to the lake. "Josh, come on, take my hand. Let's go check out the fish." There was an eager edge to his voice that wasn't there before. It made me have a nervous feeling in the pit of my stomach. My eyes shot back up to the house, and there was my dad using big, frantic arm motions, waving me inside the house, fear in his eyes. The dad who stood outside with me was even more persistent now. "Josh, I said let's go, now." He had a tone to his voice that had somehow become unfriendly and not so inviting. My intuition told me something was off about this, but my eyes were confused. How could my dad be outside and inside? I decided to tell my dad to wait a second and that I wanted to get Sissy from the house to come down and watch the fish with us. Before I could wait for his answer, I darted back to the house as fast as I could, with the worms still in my hand. When I walked through the front door, my dad ran for me as fast as he could. He scooped me up and locked the door. Mum was crying in the kitchen, and my sister was sitting at the kitchen table, hyperventilating. The worms still danced in my hand, and, unbeknownst to me, they were upset over who I'd been talking to in the yard. "Sissy, want to go down to the lake with Daddy and I said. My sister stared back at me from the kitchen table with a petrified look on her face. "Josh, that isn't Daddy outside." Confused, I looked out the window and then I saw it. Horror washed over me as I came to the realization of why everyone in the house was so scared. Standing in the yard was a grey, lanky, human-like creature. It held 2 dandelions in its hand, and its head turned to look at the house. It had no eyes or lips to cover its mouth. We could feel the pain of this creature all the way from inside the house. The thing peered at the dandelions in its hand, then slowly dropped to the ground and slithered down to the lake. We never saw it again, and that was the day I stopped playing in the rain. It happened that in the last decade of the last century, a man from Holyrood was drowned, leaving behind a wife and 2 children, the oldest a boy of 12. The death of his father ended the boy's school days, and his mother looked about for a berth in the trap fishery for him. She had no luck in finding one in Holyrood, but a trap skiff owner in Brigus agreed to take him for the summer voyage. This meant that the boy would be away from home until the trap season was over. He said goodbye to his mother and younger brother and went off to Brigus. The trap crew at Brigus were all young fellows in their late teens or early 20s. The skiff owner had converted an old 2-story shed down by the water into a rough bunkhouse where the men slept while they ate their meals in the owner's house. The young boy from Holyrood got on well enough with the rest of the crew and was doing okay as a trap fisherman. In early July, a family member of one of the trap crew got married at Cupid's. All the crew members were invited to the wedding, but the 12-year-old felt he was a bit too young to go. He said he would rather stay alone in the bunkhouse while the others went to the wedding spree. They didn't expect to get back to Brigus until well after daylight. The men left for the wedding spree early in the evening, and when it got dark, the boy decided to go to bed. He didn't feel scared or anything, although he missed the company of the other men, and he had no trouble going to sleep. Later, he awakened with a strange feeling that something was wrong. He didn't know what time it was, for he had no watch, but it was pitch black in the loft of the old bunkhouse. He lay there wondering what time it was and what it was that had awakened him. Then he heard it, a funny noise, a sort of slurpy, swishy sound coming from the direction of the ocean and growing louder. He sat up in bed and listened very carefully. It was getting closer. The swishy, slurpy sound of someone walking in boots filled with water. Suddenly he was afraid. The hair on the back of his neck began to rise. His heart thumped and thumped in his chest. He wanted to jump from the bed and run, but it was as if he was frozen to the spot. The sound grew louder and louder. The door to the shed swung open, and it was coming up the ladder to the sleeping loft. It came towards the bed. He was paralyzed with fright. As the unknown thing from the sea approached the bed, the boy was aware of the pungent smell of salt water mixed with kelp and decaying seaweed. He then felt it climbing on the mattress. A strand of cold, wet hair fell across his face, and a bony hand touched his forehead. The touch of the thing broke the spell that had bound him to the bed. With a scream of horror, he leaped from the bed, tumbled down the ladder, and fled to the house of the trap skiff owner at the top of the lane. It was here the trap crew found him the next morning when they got back from the wedding spree. He was crouched behind the stove, hardly able to speak. After a while, he managed to tell them the whole frightful story, shivering at the memory of his night of horror. The owner of the skiff told him it wasn't the first time someone had met the unknown creature from the sea. No one had any idea of what it was or the purpose of its nocturnal visits to the shed. The boy wasn't sure whether or not he could sleep in that loft again, but remembering he was the sole supporter of his widowed mother and little brother, he put on a bold face and said he didn't mind going back as long as the rest of the crew were there too. They then had breakfast, and just as they finished there was the sound of cartwheels outside the door. A few minutes later the boy's mother entered looking for her son. She too had a strange story to tell, a terrible dream that had brought her to see her son. The night before she had awakened at 2 o'clock with a terrible feeling that some danger threatened her son. So strong was the dream that she couldn't rest until she had talked with him. When daylight broke, she borrowed her neighbour's horse and cart and left to see him. On hearing his story, she didn't hesitate, but took the frightened boy back to Hollywood with her. A few days later, he got a berth with a Hollywood crew and was able to support his family once again. However, he never forgot the thing from the sea and was curious as to what it wanted. Some years later, as a young man, he went back to Brigus with the intention of spending another night alone in the shed loft. This time, if the unknown creature came out of the sea, he intended to ask who it was and what it wanted. Sadly, he was too late, for a mysterious fire had destroyed the shed a few years previous. The identity of the thing from the sea would remain forever a mystery. One night, John Hennigan, who lives in Kilvolan, and his wife had come in from visiting neighbours and had gone straight to bed. Shortly afterwards, John heard a knock at the door. It was very late, so he took his gun with him and went out to see what was in it. And what did he see as he stood at the door? But 4 bright white dogs outside his house. As soon as he saw the dogs, he closed the front door and went back to his room. Looking out the window, he saw that the dogs were standing at his gate, and he told his wife to get up and take a look at them. The two of them stood at the window and saw that the dogs, instead of leaving, were standing up on their back legs, grinning broadly back at them. After that night, the dogs disappeared and were never seen. My husband and brother's family and I ranch in remote wilderness. It was during the downturn of the economy that I began range riding for extra money, and as my husband was ill, my brother took on the duties of the ranch. Well, range riding is watching over cattle in the mountains on horseback with dogs. It's a silent and sometimes dangerous job, but full of great beauty. I've worked in wilderness and with wild animals all my life and feel quite comfortable in the mountains. But in truth, I am getting a bit old to be doing this work. But I had no choice really, as we needed the money just to survive. So I wanted to tell you about something that happened in the fall when the trees were still turning. I drove my rig to one of my day camps and I got my horse out and let my dogs out and I began to saddle up for the day. I mounted up, turned on my InReach, which is a safety device that is used to track my position, and I rode to a game trail that I needed to explore, and I climbed up into the mountains and came to an old logging road that I'd never been on before. One direction of this road led to a dead end, and the other sloped down into a valley. So I started down towards the valley, and then it seemed in the blink of an eye I was on a road that I knew really well, that was very close to my day camp where I'd parked my rig. This was really strange, and I could hardly believe that it was happening at the time. My sense of direction is keen, and I know how to ride in the wilderness. And to add to this, my InReach had changed from sending a signal every 10 minutes to every 4 hours. And I couldn't, for the life of me, get it to reset. But then, when I left that particular area, it changed back to sending a signal every 10 minutes, just as it was programmed to do. Anyway, I carried on with my day of work, confused, but otherwise fine. So 2 days later, I needed to go back to that area. Again, I parked my rig, got out, got my horse and dogs, and I turned around to see that there were 2 people standing in the meadow there. They smiled at me and said, "We knew you. We've met you a couple of times." I looked at them closely and I didn't recognize them at all. They were tall and slender, fit looking, with silver grey hair, and it was a man and a woman. I said to them, "Well, hi there," as I didn't want to appear rude and didn't want to say that I didn't recognise them. "What are you doing all the way out here?" I asked. And they replied, "We are camping." I just nodded, and I remember thinking that their camp mustn't be too far because they had nothing with them at the time. Then the woman came up and she petted my horse and then my dogs, and they all liked her, and I prepared to mount up. But to my frustration, my mounting block must have fallen off the rig on the rough drive up the mountain. "Well, heck," I said, "my mounting block must have fallen off my truck. I really need it first thing in the morning too, as I'm getting a bit old and stiff in my joints." They nodded and said, "Yes, older." Then they smiled. Well, it seemed an odd thing for them to say, but I continued on and I managed to get up onto my horse. Then they said, "We will go and find your mounting block for you." "Well, thanks, that's very kind," I said, "but it might be halfway down the mountain for all I know." Well, they just smiled and said, "We will find it." I asked the woman if she wanted a candy, as I happened to have some chocolate truffles in my pocket. Well, she nodded and happily accepted one, but her male companion declined my offer. So I gave her the less squash truffle, and then I rode off to start work for the day. Well, when I returned to my rig hours later, I was delighted to see my mounting block was sitting there, but the man and the woman were gone. And that's when I noticed my inReach had gone weird again. It read that I'd been in that area for just 28 minutes, rather than the hours that I knew that I'd been there. Then, for a second time, when I left that area, it returned to normal. I can't explain why it was malfunctioning in that particular area. The next day, as I was working in a different area, I happened upon a severely injured man who was on a logging road. He was alone and in a very bad way. Well, thank goodness that I stumbled across him because, as it happened, the mounting block proved possibly life-saving that day, as it allowed me to prop him up and stabilise his position. Without the mounting block, I wouldn't have been able to stabilise him, and I wouldn't have had the mounting block if those strangers hadn't gotten it for me. There was absolutely no time for me to have gone searching for it after I found him. He needed it right there and then. So I managed to stabilise him and call for help, and soon after a helicopter flew him out to the hospital. Well, I told my friend about this bizarre series of incidents, and she told me that these strange folks were fairies. She's Irish and she knows all about them. She said they took a liking to me and helped me to help him. So anyway, a few days later, I went back to that strange spot where I had first met and talked to them. By the way, I kept a close watch on my inReach, and it was working fine all the way until I reached that same game trail. Then it stopped working. Anyway, I left some donuts there as a gift to thank them for their help. But after that day, I never found that strange road again. We were having a great time. It was beautiful. After we had a long walk and some food, we went into our tents. Keith had 2 dogs with him in his tent, and I was alone in mine. It was about 11:30 p.m. when I started to hear footsteps outside. Now remember, there was only us in the area, so I called out to Keith to ask him what was that. Was that him walking around outside? And Keith replied, "No. Why? What is it?" I said, "I hear footsteps outside." And he called out, "Just go to sleep." Well, a few moments later, I heard them again, so I called Keith again and said, "Okay, what's going on?" He said, "I know. Now I hear them too." Well, soon after, the side of the tent lit up. Was the right side. Not much, just a bit lighter where I could see images. First, it was a tiny person with really spiky hair walking past my side of the tent. Then it did it again, but its hair changed from spiky hair to like a Robin Hood shaped hat. Then, this is what really got me, it showed me a hand, but with really long fingers wriggling at the side of the tent. And I mean really long fingers. Then Keith shouted at me that he could hear sniffing and grunting at his tent. Now, we don't have wild pigs here in Ireland, so we both jumped up and went out of the tent to look, only to find nothing at all. Now, I did not believe in fairies, but this whole experience went on from 11:30 till about 7:30 a.m. We didn't get one bit of rest. And the last part of this terrifying experience was about 6:30 to 7:15 a.m. when this scary, wild wind came up from nowhere and continued for about 20 minutes. till eventually we both just said, enough is enough. We packed up and left for home. So when I got home, I looked up the history of Glenmalure, and there were some battles that happened there a long time ago with the British back in the day. But I also found that there is a lot of activity with fairies there. So I looked up that too and found out that what we had seen was a higher fairy with the spiky hair and the very long fingers. I was in shock. So was Keith. I tell you, I have never, ever had anything like this happen to me before. Was there a reason for this? Did we camp on their land? Or did we block their path? Or were we too loud? I really don't know, but it terrified both of us. On the top of Slieve Golry there once was worked a great sand pit by the local peasantry, who made their living by quarrying sand and trading it to distant contractors, who were at that time building provincial towns in the Midlands. Now, at the back of this sand pit, on the southwest side, there was a deep hole, or well. It was held sacred by the local people, and anyone who interfered with it in any way was supposed to meet with trouble. However, the sand pit was becoming exhausted, and year by year the quarrymen were working in the direction of the well. As time went on, the seam was being worked until the quarrying almost reached the well. One day, the sand in the face of the pit turned into yellow clay, and the men had to cease work. They left off, but commenced work on the southeast side of the quarry. Owing to the material being held up for some days, the men were obliged to work overtime, which meant working until nightfall. The first dusky evening that the men worked, they saw a blue light rising out of the well, and this made them very fearful. Some of the braver men amongst the crowd ventured to walk towards the well, but they were driven back instantly by a very strong, sickening smell of sulphur. At least, that's what they thought it was. The next day, the men began to work again and didn't leave the quarry until nightfall. This time, small pieces of sand and stones came out from the direction of the well. Little by little, the sand or stones became larger until finally the men were obliged to depart from the quarry altogether. They went back a distance of about 100 yards from the quarry and stood in conversation for some time, watching the showers of stones which were being belched from the well. As the evening went on, the stones became much larger until finally large boulders were being flung all around the quarry. This caused the men to debate among themselves the cause of such a remarkable happening, and they soon decided to go home. Some of the men called on a very old man on their way home and told him what had occurred. He told them that there was a fairy well on the top of Slieve Golry and asked the men in the name of God to close the well early next morning. A small party of men went back to the quarry the next day to close it, and on arriving at the spot, what did they find but a big granite flag covering the well? This flag is still to be seen on the top of Slieve Golry. The men then, through fear, closed in the quarry and made it level with the rest of the mountain. And no one has ever dug for sand in that part of the mountain since. A man lived in Glen Keane with his wife and young family. He had only one cow, and one day he was shocked to discover that she had been stolen, or so he had thought. The following evening, you see, he saw his cow grazing at Cruckaling Rock. He went towards her and watched as she disappeared into the rock. So he returned the next evening, and there she was. This time he got himself between the cow and the rock. Well, the cow made a dive past him and got between the man and the rock. He grasped at the cow and managed to get hold of the cow's tail, but the rest of the cow disappeared into the rock, leaving the tail in the man's hands. He swore out loud to all who were listening that he would come back the next day and blast the rock to pieces if the fairies did not leave back his cow. Imagine his surprise to find his cow standing at the byre door, safe and sound, when he got home that evening. A man named Callahan lived in Glenaganon. Now he had a field with a big rock in it, and close by this rock was a hedge. All the local people knew that every evening the fairies danced around this big rock. One day, Callahan declared that he was going to take away the rock and the hedge too. Many tried to talk him out of such needless and reckless action. Even a priest who lived in the town told him not to interfere with the rock. But, as they say, some people just won't be told. So it was Callahan would not listen to reason, and soon after began to cut the hedge. And as soon as he began, a swarm of white rats rushed out of the hedge. Callahan began to throw stones at them to frighten them away, but it was no use. They ran in circles around his legs. Then one of the white rats put its own tail in its mouth and began to whistle. In less than a minute, there were thousands of white rats circling around Callahan and the stone. Callahan ran through the white rats and away out of the field in fright. He went straight to the priest and told him all that had happened, and the priest said it was the fairies themselves had sent the rats. Well, Callahan never again touched the hedge or the rock. About 50 years ago, 2 men from Ballywilly were returning home from morning mass on a Sunday, and they walked up to the hill to take a look at their sheep. When they were going around Craig Nave, they saw a house which they knew was never there before. The men stood for a while, wondering what to do. They knew well enough what their eyes were seeing, but knew too that all was not as it should be. Eventually they decided to take a look and approached the strange house. The 2 men entered the door and saw, to their astonishment, an old woman sitting hunched at the fire. It was a scene they had witnessed countless times before: children playing on the ground and a young woman making dinner. The house looked to be an ordinary country house. The young woman spoke to them as any person would, telling them to sit at the fire and wait till her husband came. At that moment, the old woman turned her head and signalled to the men silently not to sit, but for them to go back out the door. This they did, and were not 3 yards from the door when they turned back around to find there was nothing to be seen. The house and all its occupants were gone. There was nothing but the green field they had known, or thought they had known, so well. Many later said that had they waited until the husband came, they would never have gotten out. There was a fishing spot out off Galway where fish were known to be very plentiful, and many fishermen used to fish there after 12 o'clock at night. One night an old man stood just looking out over the sea before he entered his boat, and he saw a white fairy boat coming in to the place where the fish were known to be plentiful. The man decided not to take his boat out that night, but returned home and told of what he had seen. This old man, this fisherman, knew 6 men who were determined to go out the following night, and he went to them and warned them that it wasn't safe on account of his having seen the white fairy boat, but they did not heed his advice. That night the 6 men were watched as they sailed out to the fishing spot. Soon the white fairy boat appeared, and it swept their boat away. They were never seen again.